Let me say to you, Sarah, and to all of our viewers today, that my prayers go out for everyone's health and safety, to you and yours. God willing, we'll all stay healthy, and we'll soon see an end to this crisis, the health crisis and the economic crisis that came with it. And I'll also say there's another pandemic in the world that whose results are perhaps more long-term, and that is a general, a dearth that we see too often in courage and moral clarity in standing up for principle. And so I want to begin by complimenting you, Sarah and Emmett, because you are one of the antidotes to that pandemic. You are, you continuously and consistently speak with moral clarity and principle on issues of such great importance to the United States, to the Jewish people, and of course, to the future of the world that we all are trying to build. And so thank you, Sarah, thank you, Emmett, and thanks for having me today. We are at a point of great transition in the world today with the coronavirus creating a great realignment in our world. And if one looks at the anti-Semitic tsunami that has come with the coronavirus, blaming Jews for creating the virus, blaming Jews for spreading the virus, blaming Jews for profiting from the virus, alleging a conspiracy that this is part of some kind of plot for world domination. And this is all over the internet. And while I'm not prepared to say it marks an increase in anti-Semitism, it's too early to know whether this is an increase in anti-Semitism or simply a refocus of the same anti-Semitism that's out there. But what's important to remember here is that this new anti-Semitism is really not new at all. In fact, the history of anti-Semitism is that it always adapts to current events. It always embraces realities in the world and makes use of those realities to drive the underlying message, which is consistent throughout, that the Jew is an agent of doom. That is really what it is. And that's why you and so many other great organizations, but certainly I, in my last 14 months since I've been appointed, have been making the point that the so-called new anti-Semitism, not the very new coronavirus one, but the less new anti-Semitism of the past 30 years or so, that focuses on Zionism and the state of Israel, is not new. It's, again, Jew hatred, the same Jew hatred throughout history, but focused on current events being, of course, that today there is a Jewish sovereign, the state of Israel. And so that's what we see, and that's what we have to understand. We have to strip all of these veneers and the ideological clothing and the flavor of the time and look at what anti-Semitism is in its underlying form. And that is hatred of the Jew in the community, the Jew down the street, or the Jew among the countries. And it is so critical that all of us stand together, shoulder to shoulder, to oppose this. Look, President Trump had every opportunity, calls anti-Semitism the vile poison of anti-Semitism. That's how he always speaks about it. And I think that's such an important description, because anti-Semitism isn't only about the Jews. And the fight against anti-Semitism isn't only about protecting Jews. It is certainly that. But anti-Semitism is a vile poison because it is a threat to all of humanity. And the history of this pernicious ancient hatred is that it is history's greatest barometer of human suffering. And every society that has imbibed this vile poison, as the president calls it, has rotted to its core. Look at the ideologies that we have confronted in the last 100 years. Look at, we just commemorated Yom HaShoah. Just yesterday at sundown, Yom HaShoah ended. It wasn't just 6 million Jews that were murdered through the Nazi ideology. It was a continent that was reduced to rubble. And this was an ideology that defined itself through anti-Semitism. Now let's move to contemporary days. What are the greatest threats to peace and stability in our world today over the last, let's say, 15 years? Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's start with those four. If you look at the ideology of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hezbollah, these are four movements, in a sense, movements that define themselves through anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism isn't a footnote or an afterthought. It is a core feature of these ideologies. And look at the threats that these four movements have brought to the world. And so it is absolutely critical we understand that the fight against anti-Semitism is really a fight that all humanity has against evil. And so if you want to really be progressive and build that better world, if you want to elevate the human condition, if you want to reduce human misery in the world, this is one of the first addresses. And that's what's so important to understand. Yesterday, as I said, was Yom HaShoah, but let me talk about some more anniversaries. In a few days, we will commemorate the one-year anniversary, that's, I believe, on Monday, the 27th, of the murder of Lori Kay, Zichronah Livracha, who was murdered in Chabad of Poway in San Diego. And I actually spoke at her memorial service 2 days after she was murdered, and maybe 3 or 4 days after she was murdered. The murder of Lori Kay occurred exactly on the 6-month date of the murders at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue. I chose that date in October, the one-year anniversary of the Pittsburgh murders, to arrive as United States Special Envoy representing our country in Halle, Germany. I arrived in Halle, Germany to visit the site of the Yom Kippur synagogue attack, where several people were killed. The assailant wasn't able to break into the synagogue, but several others in the surrounding area were tragically murdered in that attack. And I wanted to arrive in Halle on that date, October 27th, to make the point that the rise in anti-Semitism we are seeing today, most recently manifested in this wave of coronavirus-related anti-Semitism, is not an American problem, and it's not a German problem, and it's not a European problem, nor is it a Middle Eastern problem. It is a global problem that requires nothing other than a focused, coordinated global solution. And so what I'd like to do, Sarah, is say a little bit about our priorities, what has driven my focus and my team's focus over the last several months, and what will be our focus over the next few months. First and foremost, security. Physical security is a sovereign's most fundamental obligation to its citizenry. And it is the basis of quality of life. If one doesn't feel safe, if one can't leave their home and know that they're free of attack, or put their kids on a school bus and know that those kids are safe, you cannot live that way. And so assuring that Jewish communities throughout the world have what they need to ensure their safety to every extent possible is priority number one for my office and my team. And so as I go around the world and as I meet with interior ministries, my first question is, let's talk about what you're doing to ensure that the Jewish communities have the security they need. My second priority is internet anti-Semitism. And let's face it, as we just spoke about regarding the coronavirus, while the internet certainly isn't the cause of anti-Semitism, it is the chief vector of this social malady. It is the reason why anti-Semitism spreads. A recent European study shows that the process of radicalization online is 25% of the time it takes to radicalize a young man offline. I say young man, I'm being gender specific intentionally, because it is typically male teenagers who are alienated, angry, finding themselves, who are lured, who are seduced into these venomous pits of anti-Semitic hatred. And by the way, not just anti-Semitic hatred, racial hatred of anyone and everyone unlike them. You know, those of us who are parents would never think of allowing our kids to wander in neighborhoods of danger and crime and drugs and kidnapping. We would never think, we wouldn't be able to sleep at night. And yet every day, kids are doing exactly that, wandering through virtual neighborhoods of crime and danger and seduction and evil. And as bad as things might be on the visible web, and many of our viewers know and have heard about the anti-Semitism on the visible sort of transparent web, I can assure you that it is far, far worse in what's called the dark web. I was shocked. It's hard to shock me, my line of work. I was shocked when I saw the unvarnished, unabashed Jew hatred expressed in terms that make your jaw drop, that is expressed all the time. Once you accord these haters the thinnest veil of anonymity and protection, that's what's going on in the dark web. And this is where kids are being drawn, not just in America, all over the world, in Europe, in the United States. And this is in multiple languages. And so it is so important we address the spread of hatred on the internet. Now, I'm not talking about censorship. The First Amendment is sacrosanct. But here's what I mean. Once speech crosses that line into incitement, it is no longer protected. And we have to be willing, all of our countries have to be willing to come down very hard on incitement to violence, on that kind of Jew hatred and racial hatred that crosses the line from protected speech to incitement. And then when it comes to protected speech, and look, a lot of anti-Semitism is protected by the First Amendment, right? The Nazis had a right to march in Skokie, Illinois. That's a Supreme Court case. But we have to be willing to condemn it in unequivocal terms. We have to stand together and say this is despicable and vile. It might be protected. They might have a right to say it, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't condemn it. And sometimes we get confused about First Amendment and condemnation. First Amendment is a protection against imprisonment and censorship. It's not a protection against condemnation. And so we've got to be able to condemn strongly protected speech. And so priority number 2 for me is the internet. A third priority, and this is absolutely critical, is education. We have to get serious about educating our kids, not only on anti-Semitism and on the dangers of anti-Semitism. Of course, we all talk about the erosion in Holocaust education. Again, Yom HaShoah was yesterday, and a CNN survey just showed that, recently showed that fewer and fewer kids in Europe know what the Holocaust is or have ever heard of the Holocaust, and the statistics in the United States aren't that much better. And so we've got to do better in terms of educating about the Holocaust and educating about anti-Semitism, but that's not what I'm talking about. When I talk about the importance of education, I mean educating in philosemitism. I mean crafting a curriculum such that every kid in every classroom knows what the Jewish people are, what Jewish contributions have been to every country. Can you tell the history of the United States or of Germany or of Poland or of Hungary or of England or of France, and the list goes on? Can you tell the history of these countries without talking about the Jewish contributions to these countries? I'll give you a specific example. I was not too long ago in Germany when we could travel diplomatically, and I look forward again to visiting my great counterparts in Germany. But Germany in 2021 will commemorate, ready for this, 1,700 years of Jewish history in Germany, 1,700 years. And so my question for them was, and this is, I believe, what they're working on, is what's going to be the curriculum? It's not enough to say, well, 1,700 years, how nice. What will Germany do such that every kid in every classroom knows that there have been 1,700 years of inextricable and inseparable Jewish history in Germany, and the influence goes both ways? How many German kids know that the vernacular language of European Judaism from Russia to England is a form of German? How many German kids know that? The answer is practically none. And so we have to get serious about educating in philosemitism, because it will never be enough only to fight the manifestations of anti-Semitism. Of course you have to do that. You have to fight the attacks and the anti-Semitic hate orgies that you see and all of that. You've got to fight that. But if all you do is fight the manifestations, you'll win battles, but you'll never win the war. The strategic weapon in the war against anti-Semitism is education. To get at the root of the problem, because anti-Semitism, apart from its manifestations, is an idea. It's a worldview, and ultimately it's a spiritual illness. And so education is key. We will shortly, in a few days, begin Jewish American Heritage Month. Jewish American Heritage Month, going on 15 years now, has been proclaimed by every president of the United States, starting with George W. Bush. And my question is, what do we do for Jewish American Heritage Month? Do we educate our kids? By the way, I've asked this of Jewish audiences, around the country where I go. How many of you know that May every year is Jewish American Heritage Month? And I get blank stares. By the way, I'm not putting anyone down here. Before recently, I didn't know it either. And you know why we don't know it? Because we don't do anything for it. You all know about African American Heritage Month because during African American Heritage Month, the African American community actually does something. There's programming, there are festivals, there's curriculum, there are posters. We have a month dedicated to talking about the contributions of Jews to American history, and what do we do? Nothing. Now, if we really want to get serious about the fight against anti-Semitism, this is where we have to get serious, to really go on the offense, not only play defense, but to go on the offense. So education is critical. And lastly, let me say, and there are several other priorities. I want to leave time for questions, so I don't want to talk about all of them. But let me lastly talk about the campuses. Look, I've been involved in campus affairs for 30 years. I was a former international president of AEPI, and I dealt with 190 campuses in 6 countries. And so I know, even before I was on this job, I've known what's going on the campuses, and my work in the last 14 months as U.S. Special Envoy have more than confirmed what I knew from before. Student leaders in Europe and in the United States say basically the same thing. And that is, if you want to be safe as a Jewish student, if you want to go unmolested on campus, you have to completely divorce yourself from Israel and Zionism. You can't mention the Z word. And you certainly can't be overtly pro-Israel, a proud Zionist Jew. That simply is not acceptable. You will be marginalized, isolated, discriminated against, and really put in fear in many cases. That's what's going on. And I tell you, I couldn't be prouder that just a few months ago, President Trump signed a game-changing executive order that adopts the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and that applies Title VI civil rights protections to Jewish students. Basically what the president is saying, and he said it, he looked at the cameras when he signed it, and he said to universities, if you promote the discrimination and harassment of your Jewish students, this is going to be very, very expensive for you. You are going to lose your federal funding. And I promise you, there wasn't a university president or chancellor in the country that did not hear that speech. And it is critical. Alan Dershowitz was there and spoke and said, in all of my years on campus, he's been around for a while, I said, all of my years as an academic, this event is the single most important step ever taken to fight campus anti-Semitism. It's a game changer. And it is so deeply, deeply important. And in adopting, by the way, the IRA definition, aside from the Title VI civil rights protection issue, but in adopting the standard international definition of anti-Semitism, the United States is putting itself among the leaders in that effort to get more and more countries to adopt this definition. It is one of my chief diplomatic asks. It is yet another priority we have when I go overseas. Adoption of this definition of anti-Semitism and appointment of an anti-Semitism coordinator for the country is critical to getting the job done. So those are our priorities. There are a few others that I'll leave for questions. But what I want to end my remarks on, Sarah, is some good news. Because, we are right to talk about the bad news. You want to make the world better, you have to focus on the problems. And that's legitimate and that's correct. And there's a lot of bad news. Anti-Semitism is rising, attacks are up, incitement is up. We know that, and we've talked about that. But it is very, very important to understand that there is a lot of good news. And so I want to end on 3 points of good news, and not just good news, very, very good news for us in this fight. Number one, we are not alone. One of the greatest pleasures I have had and do have as Special Envoy is the partnerships that I have and the opportunity to work with leaders across the world, non-Jews, at every levels of government. From some of them are even heads of government, but certainly ministers and parliamentarians and anti-Semitism coordinators who could not possibly be more committed to this fight against anti-Semitism. They are eloquent, powerful spokespeople for this. And they understand that, again, it's not only about protecting Jews, it is about protecting and ensuring the future of their own children. These are people like Katharina von Schnurrbart, the anti-Semitism coordinator for the EU, who has been a champion, really has changed what Europe has been doing to fight Jew hatred there. People like Lords John Mann and Eric Pickles in the UK, Frédéric Poitier in France, Felix Klein in Germany, Georg Georgiev in Bulgaria. These are people who have taken up the mantle appointed to fight anti-Semitism. And they are doing groundbreaking work. It's the reason why every police cadet in France today is being trained on hate crimes investigation. You know, it's the reason why the IRA definition has been adopted in the UK. It's the reason why the Bundestag in Germany and in Austria, significantly in Germany and in Austria, have both passed resolutions that BDS is anti-Semitism. And so there is a difference being made on the ground because of our great partners. And so that's piece of good news number one. Piece of good news number two is that the Jewish people do have self-determination. The state of Israel does exist. And Jewish self-determination is represented by a country that is a light unto the world, a beacon of democracy and innovation and tikkun olam, protected by a strong and secure and moral and decent armed forces. And the strength of the state of Israel makes the Jewish people stronger everywhere and better able to fight and confront anti-Semitism. And finally, piece of good news number three, that with all of the issues that we have with rising anti-Semitism, the United States of America is still the most philo-Semitic country in the history of the world. And the United States is today led by the most philo-Semitic administration we have ever had in American history. From President Trump to Vice President Pence to my boss, Secretary Pompeo, the list goes on and on and on. And of course, I haven't even gotten to Jared Kushner and David Friedman and Avi Berkowitz and all the others. I mean, it is extraordinary. It is extraordinary to see the commitment to I would say unprecedented commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, to protecting the Jewish people throughout the world, and to supporting the state of Israel. Most recently, the peace vision that was unveiled that recognizes the unbreakable connection of the Jewish people to the Jewish homeland, including Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, the disputed territories. Before that, the decision by the Department of State not to use the term occupied territories, the decision of the United States that Jewish towns and villages in Judea and Samaria are not a war crime. I mean, the idea that it would be a war crime for Jews to live in Judea and Samaria is appalling. And of course, that's not what international law says, and the United States now has taken that position. Closing the PLO office in Jerusalem, defunding UNRWA so that hard-earned American tax money doesn't go to printing anti-Semitic textbooks. How could we fund anti-Semitic textbooks? We don't anymore because President Trump said enough. Defunding the notorious pay for slave programs where money goes to pay monthly stipends to killers. How could we be doing that? Well, we don't do that anymore. Recognizing Jerusalem, the eternal undivided capital of the Jewish people in the state of Israel, and moving our embassy there. Recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And the list goes on and on and on. We have never had an administration, or any one of these steps by an administration would make it stand out as a particularly pro-Israel administration. And this has all happened in 3 years, and in many cases under 3 years. And so, look, we've never had anything like this. And so we have great reason to be optimistic. Anti-Semitism is not a fool's, fighting anti-Semitism is not tilting at windmills. It's not a fool's errand. If I weren't optimistic that we could roll this back, I wouldn't have taken the job. And so I'm confident that with leaders like President Trump, Vice President Pence, and Secretary Pompeo, with our partners and friends around the world, and with a strong and secure state of Israel, we will roll back this rise in anti-Semitism, and we will build for ourselves, for our children and our grandchildren, that better, more just, more decent world that they so richly deserve. Thank you so very much. Thank you for your partnership, Sarah and EMET, in the amazing work that you do. And with that, I look forward to hearing the questions of our viewers.
Okay. Thank you so much. And Elan, thank you so much for ending on that positive note. Um, I'm going to ask you a question which is a little bit less optimistic. You and I were both in the White House on December 11th when President Trump signed that wonderful executive order recognizing the IRA definition and making sure that Jewish students had the same civil rights protections on college campuses as Black or Hispanic and other minority students, which is a long time coming. However, and that has to do with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. But there's another Title VI that we at EMET have been working on forever, and that's of the Higher Education Act, which gives taxpayers' dollars to regional studies programs, including Middle Eastern studies programs. And in 1978, when Edward Said wrote Orientalism, that revolutionized the teaching of Middle Eastern studies, and it became almost impossible to survive any of those classes if you are a Zionist, or even if you're an American patriot, for that, because it puts everything within the framework of colonialism and actually American imperialism. And at this point, I've been working for years. In 2008, we were able to get Congress to pass an amendment that said that in order to get these taxpayers' dollars, you have got to engage in a diversity of perspectives. And that has been totally overlooked and ignored in the classroom. So my question is, we have this highly entrenched institutional anti-Semitism, if you include the IRA definition saying that anti-Semitism denies the right of Jews for self-determination, there's highly entrenched anti-Semitism within most Middle Eastern studies departments now. How can you help us make the universities aware that this is a violation right now of what is American law? Can you help me promulgate that?
So first of all, I want to thank you for drawing that distinction between the Higher Education Act and the Civil Rights Act, because it's very important to understand that not every expression of discrimination, not every expression of anti-Semitism rises to the level of a civil rights violation, and certainly, bias in a Middle Eastern and Near East Studies department might not rise to the level of a civil rights violation. Now, I know that there have been a lot of discussions about whether funding from foreign governments and foreign interests that flow in large amounts to American universities might violate a number of federal laws, by the way, not just the Education Act, but also FARA and other things, where there's an expectation, potentially, in some cases, perhaps an expectation of influence, which of course triggers all kinds of other laws. Look, I don't want to speak for other agencies of the government and certainly the Department of Education, but I can tell you that in my conversations across the interagency, the administration is very much aware of this and certainly concerned about it. And I compliment you, Sarah, for your efforts in shedding light on this and making sure that the American public is aware. Because, at the end of the day, campuses aren't just, some, random part of our society. Campuses are where our future leaders are trained, are inculcated. It's where the future CEOs of companies and members of Congress and leaders in civil society, and thought leaders, it's where they come from. And while the federal government certainly does not want to be censoring content, educational content, that's not what we do, and that's not what we should be doing. We absolutely want to be able to feel secure. All Americans, all of us as Americans, want to be able to feel secure that our kids are in good hands when we send them to classrooms, that they're not being poisoned and turned. I'll tell you, it's not just universities anymore. I was giving a speech in New York, and a kid came up to me and said, a high school student, and by the way, not even a senior. I mean, we're talking about a young high school student. I think he's 15. He was a freshman or sophomore in high school at an elite private New York City high school. And he came up to me. He said, you know, you're talking about the campuses. He says, do you know what's going on in the high schools? He said, I've got teachers telling me that the state of Israel is like a Nazi regime. He says, that's what's going on in my classroom. And so all of us as Americans have an interest in making sure that our kids are being taken care of. You know, we entrust our children to teachers, K through 12, and then we, you know, send them off, or they send themselves off to universities, and you know, we expect them to be educated properly. And I can't thank you enough for shedding light on this. I was a keynote speaker recently at a conference of alums for campus fairness. And we were stressing some of these points. Look, I mean, I think this is absolutely critical, and I'll continue to be a very strong advocate of it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now I'm going to turn the podium over to our very, very capable Sarah Leah Thompson, our Director of Communications, who will read some of the questions that have come in.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for all this information and for your continued support of Jews everywhere. It is so appreciated. So we have a lot of questions. We have a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer all of them, but please know that people are really happy to be hearing from you right now. So our first question, have you met with Sir Carr Starmer? He seems sincere in his repudiation of Labour Party's embrace of anti-Semitism. However, anti-Semitism is entrenched in Labour, left, and Islamists in UK. Will he change the course of the UK regarding anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the UK, in your opinion?
I have not met with him. I look forward to it. I can tell you I am highly, highly encouraged by what we're seeing. We think we have to be cautiously optimistic, but there is definitely cause for optimism. You know, one of the questions I think we need to ask and instruct ourselves in, and this is, Sarah, deeply, deeply important, both Sarahs, deeply, deeply important. And that is, why did this happen in the UK? Why is it that the Labour Party was resoundingly defeated? Why is it that you had lifelong Labour MPs walking out of the Labour Party saying, I cannot sit at the same table with anti-Semitism? Sarah, you're frozen. Can everyone hear me? Sarah Stern?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
As long as I'm, yeah. So why is it that these MPs, you know, walked out? There was basically, before the election, a civil war in the Labour Party. That's not an understatement. It was a civil war in the Labour Party. One of the leaders I mentioned before, a dear friend, Lord John Mann, lifelong Labour member, walked out and he said, I won't do this anymore. And there were no shortage of others. I mean, there's a long list. It happened because the Jewish community stood united. There was no division. There was the Jewish community put aside partisanship, put aside ideological difference, put aside socioeconomic difference, and stood together because they saw Jeremy Corbyn and his group of leaders in the Labour Party as a clear and present danger, a threat to the future of the Jewish community in the UK. In fact, the Jewish community so stood together that in an unprecedented move, 3 competing Jewish newspapers in London, competitors, published a joint editorial on the front page, extraordinary for being joint and extraordinary for being on the front page. Editorials don't appear on the front page. It was under the banner headline, United We Stand. And then there were signed by the 3 editorial boards, all 3 front pages the same. And in that editorial, they basically said, you know, Jeremy Corbyn and his group represent a threat to the future of the Jewish people in the United Kingdom. I mean, it was a jaw-dropping piece. And then they followed it up after that with a rally that they entitled, not my name for it, they entitled it Enough is Enough. And they rallied together, young and old, left and right, liberal, conservative, Tory and Labour. And they came together and they said, enough is enough. And what happened was extraordinary. And here is another piece of optimism. You know, you talk about good news in the world, not just that that look at the results, right? And look at the transformation and the self reflection and accounting that's going on within labor. But let's even say something else. Do you know that a large percentage of voters surveyed in exit polls in the UK said that Labour's anti-Semitism was one of the reasons they voted the way they voted? Ordinary Brits, non-Jewish Brits, were embarrassed. They were embarrassed for their country. They said, this is not the England, this is not the Britain that I want to see. I'm embarrassed. Why did this happen? It wouldn't, I promise you it wouldn't have happened, certainly not to the same extent, if the Jewish community didn't stand up and say enough is enough. And we stand united and we're putting aside our partisan differences. We've got to do that here. Now, I'm not talking about on any political issue, but I'm saying when it comes to the future of the Jewish people, when it comes to the safety of the children of the Jewish community, there can't be any division. The American Jewish community has to stand together shoulder to shoulder and arm in arm and say, we will speak in one voice. And we don't care where anti-Semitism comes from. We don't care, we're not going to differentiate between the ideological clothing it wears, the radical Israel-hating left, the despicable, violent, ethnic supremacist right, militant Islam. We are going to fight all of it, and we are not going to tolerate any of it. And that is really the prerequisite for us to work profound change in our community. And it's so important to recognize what the British Jewish community did.
Thank you so much. Our next question. From your cooperation with your counterparts around the world, is there a country that has been successful in combating anti-Semitism or eliminated it that can serve as a role model? What other methods have other countries adopted around the world?
So yes, I think actually there are many countries that we can look to. I would say, role model on what specific issue, right? I mean, this is a multifaceted fight. We're dealing with legislative action, and we're dealing with executive action. We're dealing with hate crimes prosecution, and we're dealing with condemnation, and we're dealing, so we're dealing with the campuses, educational process. So it's multifaceted. I don't know that there's any one country that does everything well. For all the good that we do in the United States, we're not perfect either, right? We're working on how to improve it. But are there things we can learn from around the world? Absolutely. First of all, parliamentary action is important. Elected parliamentarians, legislators are the voice of the people. And so, adoption by parliaments, by legislative bodies of certain standards, whether it's in non-binding resolutions or otherwise, are very important, which is why I have around the world spoken about the incredible step that the German Bundestag took maybe 7 months ago, and more recently, 8 months ago, and more recently the Austrian Bundestag took to say that BDS is anti-Semitism. I mean, think about it. When the German Bundestag says that the movement to boycott the Jewish state, the one Jewish state, is anti-Semitic and reminiscent of the Juden boycotts of the 1930s, which, by the way, of course it is. I mean, economic boycotts aren't new. It didn't even start with the Nazis. I mean, it started in the, it's in the Middle Ages, boycotts of Jews. Nothing new. And so BDS is nothing new. But the German Bundestag said it and called it out and said it's reminiscent of the Juden boycotts of the 1930s. That is an earthquake. And so I've been going around the world thanking the German Bundestag for that. And I've been going around the world more recently thanking the Austrian Bundestag for doing that. Another great thing that Germany has done is federalizing the fight against anti-Semitism. So not only is there Felix Klein, whom I should have mentioned earlier, actually, if I didn't mention him. Felix Klein is the federal anti-Semitism coordinator for Germany, who is a great friend and partner, and I've worked with him, and I'm so grateful for his work. But then they have state anti-Semitism coordinators. So there are 16 German states with their own anti-Semitism coordinators, because as we know from our federal system in the United States, the state level, the local level is where the rubber meets the road. That's where law enforcement policy often happens, and that's where educational policy happens, and so the federalization of this fight against anti-Semitism is, I think, one of the great lessons all of us can take from the German model. The UK has been extraordinary. They've really been, the statements coming out of the United Kingdom, I think is a model for the world. And I'll say the Polin Museum of Poland is, I think, an international treasure. If you want to look at how to educate in philosemitism, go to the Polin Museum in Warsaw and see how the 900-year history of the Jewish community in Poland is treated fairly and completely. The incredible contributions and also the pogroms and the anti-Semitism, both treated in the Polin Museum. And so I think there are a lot of models we can take. But at the end of the day, I'll say what I said before in my opening remarks. The United States of America is different. There is no country on earth, and there's no country in history that has been more philo-Semitic than the United States. And there has been no leadership team in American history more philo-Semitic than this leadership team. And so, if you want a real model, I think you've got to look to our country and our administration. I mean, that's the model. I mean, look, I for all the good news coming out of Europe, I mean, I still have this resistance to confronting the anti-Zionist model of anti-Semitism, not by everyone, but by some. When I raise the issue of what's going on in radicalized Islamic communities, or when I'm raise what's going on in the far left, sometimes I get from some European leaders, again, more and more Europeans are getting it, but from some as well, that's different, that's complicated. Well, it's not different, and it's not complicated. It's Jew hatred. It's just Jew hatred from another ideological camp. And no country has been better about saying that than the United States. And it's so important to understand that if you want to cherish and embrace and extol and protect the Jewish people, you have got to cherish and embrace and extol the Jewish state. And it comes hand in hand. There's only one Jewish state on earth. And so you can't really split the thing up. And I'm not talking about policy issues. Now, of course, I hear this all the time. Well, we can criticize. Of course you can criticize Israel. Any country can be criticized. America can be criticized. Israel can be criticized. But when it comes to questioning the legitimacy of the one Jewish state on earth, questioning the right of the Jewish people as a national ethnic group to self-determination in its ancient homeland, that is an attack on the legitimacy of the Jewish people. And that is anti-Semitism. And we've got to understand that. And for that, the United States is the model. As my boss, Secretary Pompeo, declared before 18,000 activists at a previous AIPAC policy conference, he said, let me go on the record. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And for that, I and all of the Jewish people throughout the world are deeply grateful.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question. As a U.S. Army officer, have you encountered anti-Semitism in the military? And if so, how did you respond to it?
I have not, actually. In fact, what I've encountered in the military is philosemitism. I'll tell you a story. When I deployed to Iraq, really early, this was the beginning of OIF-2, so we're talking about 2003, a few months after Baghdad fell. I deployed with CENTCOM, and I was in Baghdad at the presidential palace of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's presidential palace. We had taken over, and it was sort of the White House of Iraq. It's where the Coalition Provisional Authority ran the country. So it was really the nerve center of the whole country. And my team, it was an anti-terrorism team. We were based there. The chaplain of the Coalition Provisional Authority had posted in a lavish marble, high-ceilinged room that became a makeshift chapel for the Coalition Provisional Authority, had posted a list of services. And this is very typical of the chaplaincy, right? Encouraging religious devotion. It was a very ecumenical list. Catholic Mass on Sunday, Protestant worship on Sunday, Shia, Sunnah services. There was nothing Jewish on the list. And I said, what is this? We came to liberate Iraq. Are we placating regional anti-Semitism? And is that what we've come to? I said, it's not acceptable. So I walked into the chaplain's office and I said to him, sir, I was a lieutenant at the time, he was a colonel, so I was irritated, but very respectful. I said, sir, you know, you posted this list of services in the chapel, and it's great, thank you, but you know, there's nothing Jewish on the list. Is there a reason for it? And his answer was emblematic of the best of America and of the armed forces and of the chaplaincy. He said, yeah, there's a reason for it. There's nobody to lead it. I've been asking everybody. I can't, I'm a minister. I can't lead it. Can you lead service? And I said, sir, sign me up. And so the first thing we did after Baghdad fell with the full support of the coalition was conduct Hanukkah services. Using, by the way, the Chanukiah crafted by an Iraqi Jewish refugee who fled Iraq, and an artist who made a Chanukiah and donated it to the coalition, so moved by the liberation of Iraq. And we used that refugee's Chanukiah to light Hanukkah candles in the presidential palace of Saddam Hussein. And think about what Hanukkah means, the defeat of despotism and the re-sanctification of land defiled by tyranny. That's what occurred there with the full support of the armed forces. And then after that, we led Shabbat services. I had the great privilege of leading Shabbat services every single week. We had a minyan every single week. And there were non-Jews who came as well, because they were so amazed and so proud and so wanted to connect with this expression of Jewish peoplehood in a place as unlikely as the palace from which the decision had been made by Saddam Hussein a few years earlier to launch Scud missiles into Israel. And then we had a Seder. We read the Purim, Megillat Esther and Purim, and we had a Seder, and it goes on and on. That's just one example of the incredible philosemitism that I've experienced in the armed forces. And so, I think we as Americans have much to be proud of. Look, we have to focus on our problems. I will tell you that the vast majority of anti-Semitic posts on the internet in the English language come from the United States, the vast majority. And so look, we do have issues, and we've got to work on what we're seeing, which is really marginalized groups, but marginalized groups that are incredibly anti-Semitic, and a growing anti-Semitic left. We've got to be concerned about it and focused on it. But look, the United States is incredibly and deeply and historically philo-Semitic. And again, our leaders could not be more committed to this cause. And that really is a blessing and a gift, and something of which all of us should be deeply proud.
Sarle?
Thank you so much. Earlier, you spoke about the threat of internet anti-Semitism, as you just brought up again now. Have you met with or contacted people working at Facebook and Google to ask them directly what they're doing to not allow the use of their assets to further spread anti-Semitism and hate, and what are the approaches to censorship that you're taking?
Yes, in fact, I met with both of those companies at a great roundtable that was organized by the ADL, and I want to thank the Anti-Defamation League for its really outstanding work in this field. I participated at their invitation in that roundtable and made remarks on behalf of the administration. And so yes, and before the coronavirus hit, we were actually planning a trip to the Bay Area to follow up and actually meet with social media platforms and internet technology leaders there, actually at their bases, at their companies. I will tell you, we're taking this so seriously that let me tell you about a new hire on my team. I have somebody on my team. By the way, I'm proud to say that I served with him in Iraq. He then was also with the State Department as a career senior foreign service officer. He and I were in Baghdad together, and he came out of retirement to serve on my team, and he is Assistant Special Envoy for Internet Anti-Semitism. So for the first time ever in the history of the office I hold, we now have an Assistant Envoy, a team member at a senior level, specifically and exclusively focused and dedicated to confronting anti-Semitic hate on the internet. That is unprecedented. And that is how seriously we are taking this. And so yes, I have met with Google and Facebook. and I look forward to following up with them. And let me say, by the way, that they're doing some very good work on this issue. There is there's a whole program of what's called trusted flaggers, where Jewish community members can identify anti-Semitic posts that violate the terms of Facebook. It's very important to remember, we're not talking about government censorship here. We're talking about these social media platforms enforcing their own terms of service. Again, the United States is determined to protect the First Amendment, which is sacrosanct. But Facebook and Google are doing some very good things, and certainly we look forward to continuing to encourage them to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question we have, is there currently a plan to look into the tax-exempt universities to see whether or not they would lose their exemptions if they violate the free speech of pro-Israel students?
So in terms of free speech, I will point out very proudly that long before the executive order that President Trump signed last December regarding anti-Semitism in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, he signed another executive order, I believe it was last March, a year ago, protecting the First Amendment on college campuses, making sure that universities understand that students have free speech. One of the reasons why I came very strongly, I strongly criticized those who said, well, this Title VI civil rights executive order is somehow a limitation on free speech. I mean, utter nonsense. It's not a limitation on free speech. In fact, President Trump takes a backseat to no other president in terms of standing up to protect the First Amendment, specifically on college campuses, which he did with an executive order. And so we have to make sure to understand that and give the administration credit for that. So yes, free speech of students is incredibly important. This administration is determined to make sure that students have free speech, just as it is determined to prohibit harassment and discrimination, which is not protected speech. Let's be clear. That's what Title VI of the Civil Rights Act deals with, harassment and discrimination. And so all of these people who criticize the president's executive order by saying it somehow limits free speech are basically saying that harassment and discrimination is protected speech. So good luck with that argument is all I can say. And so it's the two can work hand in hand, protecting the First Amendment on campus and prohibiting discrimination and harassment on campuses. There's no contradiction or conflict between those two aims, and this administration indeed is front and center in both of those very important and critical aims.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. A lot of people have written in. Perhaps, Elan, if it's okay with you, I could forward some of the questions to you that you don't get a chance to answer, and I will be able to respond to some of our viewers. So one last question, okay?
Perfect. The last question we have, are we working with Department of Education to establish a robust education program with historical facts and, as you mentioned earlier, contributions by Jewish Americans to really have it in the education system?
So as I understand the question, it has to do with developing a curriculum that teaches Jewish history. So the federal government, the Department of Education doesn't develop curricula and is very careful about not doing that. For federalism reasons. I mean, it's very important that the Department of Education believes, and the administration believes, it's very important that the federal government not impose on states and on school districts or on universities curricula that they don't, choose to adopt. And that's a very important principle of federalism. However, like we said before, the federal government certainly wants to make sure, and all Americans want to make sure that our kids are in good hands when they go to school K through 12, and then when they go to university. And so there are a lot of organizations in civil society doing excellent work, shedding light on bias in higher education, dealing with bias in high schools, fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses. I mean, whether it's Stand With Us or AEPI or Hasbara Fellowships or APAC or just a whole host of others. I spoke about Alums for Campus Fairness before. There are a lot of organizations that are doing really extraordinarily good work and are really leaders in this. And certainly on the government side of things, we are always looking to make sure that there are no violations of law, and that again, that free speech is protected, but at the same time that money is being used as it is required to be used, and that money and the taxpayer dollars aren't being misused. And that's certainly the case, and the federal government is determined to make sure that federal money is not misused.
Wonderful. I'm going to wrap up here because we're almost hitting the witching hour of 1 o'clock, and we don't want to take the special envoy's time up too much. There is obviously an abundance of reasons why this has been the most oversubscribed webinar that we've had by far, and there is an overabundance of reasons as to why I'm really proud that Elan Carr is with the administration and that he is a personal friend of ours. We had actually been planning to honoring Elan at our upcoming Rays of Light dinner, which was supposed to be June 9th of 2020, but which we have actually had to delay because of COVID-19 to June 9th, 2021. So mark your calendars. We have got to give, no matter what happens at the elections, we have got to give Elan the kind of recognition and honor that he so richly deserves for his outstanding contribution.
That's incredibly kind of you. I'm very honored and flattered.
Yes, well, it's the least we can do. I don't know anybody who has been, such a globetrotter, who has been, working to the point of exhaustion, going throughout every capital of the world, trying to eradicate this scourge, as you say, that is actually perhaps more pernicious than even COVID-19, and had certainly been around for a lot longer. So thank you so much, and we should all continue to stay healthy and to go from strength to strength.
God willing. Thank you so much. Thank you.